I'm going to introduce the speakers for today. Sampurna Chattarji is a poet, fiction writer, translator, and editor. Her 20 books include the short story collection about Mumbai, Bombay, Dirty Love, and 2 novels, Rupture and Land of the Well, both from HarperCollins. Her translation of Joy Goswami's poetry from Harper Perennial are selected poems, and After Death Comes Water. She is joined in conversation with John Wilkinson, who was born in London and grew up in Cornish Coast and Dartmoor. After university at Cambridge, he trained as a psychiatric nurse and worked in mental health services and public health in the West Midlands, South Wales, and London's East End. In 2005, he moved to the United States and has held academic positions at the University of Notre Dame and at the University of Chicago, where he was very recently a professor in the Department of English and director of creative writing. He has an extensive publication history, which include selected poems, Schedule of Unrest in 2014. Wilkinson has also held a Fulbright and National Humanities Centers for Fellowship. Thank you so much for joining us, and if you can, join me in welcoming John and Sampurna.
Hello, Sampurna. It's a huge pleasure to meet you, even if virtually in this way. I'd like just to add to what Lena said by way of introduction, that you were not only born in Ethiopia, but you're also a space alien, I gather.
Yes.
And I've noticed how editors have difficulty in just keeping up with the tally of your publications. I know that today you're going to give us the great pleasure of hearing for the first time from your forthcoming book, Unmappable Moves. So I'm going to invite you to read first from that book, and then we'll have a conversation about it and about your work more generally, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks to everyone at Canto for having me on board. In fact, what was a forthcoming book when I sent in my bio is now a real book in my hand. And I suspect this is the first time I'm sharing it at Canto, so it's a very special moment for me to be able to read from it. I'll read a few poems, and perhaps you can stop me when you've had enough, because I do tend sometimes to go on and on. That explains the Chatterji in my surname. So this one's the opening poem. It's called Ancestress. Even I, modern woman, had such a world in my life once upon a time, of coal black waist long tresses, small fierce women whose courage seldom flailed, who hefted children heavy as sacks, spoke dialects, fanned the pale fire of ambition in the children's breasts, urged on past the moment of new births, giving daughters their determined chins, granddaughters their secret names of power and loud, open laughter. And I think I kind of dedicate this poem to my grandmothers, my Thama, my paternal grandmother, and my Didima, my maternal grandmother. The next one is called 1,000 Parents. A boy with hair might be construed the last of the series. The difference between the scrupulously clean hands and the dull pain of distance is quite clear and complete. The light never came back on the lower slopes among the rain clouds. All this is as it should be. One's attachment took the place of words. I have 1,000 parents, angular and cryptic. And I think the 1,000 Parents are really all the books that have made me. This book, Unmappable Moves, is also dedicated to those writers. And many of the titles that saw me through the 10 years of the writing of this book are embedded in some of the titles for those who like playing reading detective. This one's called Press Play Again. Signature this fear in the unending corners of rooms where space is a fold in time and a white unblinking face videos forgotten acts of violence. In dreams sentimental songs brighter than dusk lands crooning of love even as your blood fades away in tune with a father's ebbing force. Press play again. Flicker into semblance of normalcy. Hands clapping, dogs awake. Being alive to the morning, the only grace. The sun rising in a flower pot, a smell of honey in the air. What do you believe in? Love? Hearts that would survive even the confession of the murderer. The saxophone understands the tug and flow of blood. Take what is given. Gracefully guide your unbody past the signet where the nightmares come home to roost. No diktats more wearying than those that follow the immaculate conception of instruction manuals for imbecilic lovers intent on returning to wounded sites. Leaf out of page, out of step, out of sync, out of a simpleton's revenge. Grace is a given. Take it. And I think in recent times we've been thinking a lot about what citizenship might mean. Um, what do we do with defeats and victories? And must all living be by the rule book? Rule book. Infringement. Slow pressure in the center of the forehead, where living is not art but rule book. He, on the other hand, who in blue shoes brushes clean the coffee grinder of another fresh morning, he has figured living isn't about boundaries at all. The open city inside him rises with the dawn, boils a pot of water, cycles away towards happiness. And I think all of us in real times have really understood the limits within which we could find our own happinesses, especially the incarceration of the pandemic years. This one's called See for Yourself, and it's all about screen time. Slant of sun on two beloved faces, winter light, screenshot after screenshot, not enough to capture the impossible sweetness of age. Room reclaimed to oneself, silence to be drunk from the lip of a big blue cup, a childhood story given as a gift like all the others, safely growing like a boy among boy, a girl among girls, the blissful unawareness of brutality, difference, shame. And I think maybe I'll read a couple more, if that's okay.
That's great.
Um, there's we live in language. Poets invariably live in language, and as a translator and as a Bengali, I also live across two languages and across two calendars. I wrote this in the year 1420 by the Bengali calendar. This one's called Simultaneity. In the year 1420, the simultaneity of bombs in Boston and the sighting of an exquisite red-winged butterfly outside a window in Bombay does nothing to ease the jitter inside where no cameras may go. Escalating summer, crossing paths with days of no return. In that language, I never write and rarely speak. There is, there will be enough time. And this one's a continuation of my gratitude, I think, to what Bangla literature gave me as a translator. Um, and also about the way in which family invariably enters that picture, the family of poets, the legacy of those who came before us, as if we were. Urgency to gathering around poems long loved in another language. This is not false. Memory sharpens, brightens his ailing face. This is the grass of the poet who came before. This, the giraffe, the camel, the cadence. In those moments, we live as if we were immortal because the words are. Later, the clock summons us to table where worry sits, devouring. And
Thank you
I
so much.
think I'll maybe just the last one called Slaughter. This is on to 84. And I think this is again, it has to do with language and the witnessing of events. That seems to be one of the roles that the poets do. Language or not in the center of your head. A marked beast coming through slaughter on a heap of grass, killed in the streets, mattress smoking, at the age of 22. Furious men cut him up, his face through the glass, arm paralyzed, up the thin bones, through the filthy water, sat peering into his mouth. The blood that is real, in or around my body.
Thank you. For the last day, I've been immersed in your poetry, and you're an astonishingly protean poet. The range of styles you inhabit is extraordinary. And I contrast what we've just heard, for example, with the recent post-pandemic poem, Writing Isn't Everything, which actually shows that everything is possible to bring into a piece of writing. It is an extraordinarily comprehensive poem. These poems are much sparer and much more direct. I wonder if you'd like to talk a bit about the sort of connecting threads through your poetic writing over the years.
Thank you, John, for that very insightful reading. And I think, yes, I think it's been quite a long journey since the first book came out in 2007. And, if you look at the title of that book, Sight May Strike You Blind, that comes from Ramanujan's, a poem by Ramanujan called Chicago Zen, as it happens. And he says, watch your step. Sight may strike you blind in all the wrong places. And this obsession for seeing, and sometimes I think I see too much. And that's a sort of contradiction to the fact that I'm horribly myopic, almost purblind. So the desire to see, witness, record everything was at the beginning of my poetic journey a way of perhaps protecting myself against imminent blindness. I was actually worried at one point about imminent blindness. And I thought perhaps if that happens, if I've recorded everything that I actually have seen, it's a way of leaving that particular way of seeing in the world, and it won't matter anymore if I can't see. So that was a very peculiar um, uh, reason for my desire to inscribe everything. As I went along, and as you know, I also write fiction. And sometimes I treat my short fiction, especially like my Bombay stories, as kind of prose poems, because I feel you could compact them in a way that novels perhaps don't allow. But what happened in this book, John, and writing isn't everything the poem which you say is remarkably comprehensive. I think because I was stuck inside my room in with that limitation on movement, um, and because I was losing this entire faith that it mattered when people are dying, when lifelines are being cut off. I was actually questioning what is the value of writing. And if I couldn't write another word, would it matter? It was more important that somebody got their daily bread. So I think that was the reason why it was a way of sorting that out for myself, in a way, while very squarely reinserting my body into it. If you looked at Space Gulliver, there I did a kind of deflection where I kind of share the burden of existence with my doppelganger. But
Yeah.
here I took the burden squarely on myself. And I think it was a bit of a heavy weight to bear. So after I emerged from all of that into the clear light of day, as a lot of us did, it became clearer to me that I could actually leave a lot of things out. And unmappable moves happened as really came together as a book, because I did say it's 10 years of writing. It came together through a sort of self-willed act of editing. I played my own editor, and I was ruthless, and I just let a lot of things go and reshaped it into what it became eventually.
Great. Often when poets talk about their work being centered on the visual, as you just have, what that suggests is something which is relatively static or photographic. Whereas I'm struck in your new work that many of the poems are brief sequences and they're kind of shifting tableaus. They're always in movement. And that seems to be a feature of your work, that it's always in movement. Is that something you recognize?
Yes, thank you. That is an extraordinarily. It's lovely to hear that from you, because sometimes I feel, um, movement could be a blessing, but speed could be a curse. And I feel sometimes I have been cursed with speediness. It's a private demon that I've been kind of sort of trying to, at some level, exorcise myself uh, from, but also reconcile in a way that can make the poems speedy without feeling like they flew away too fast. So there is this contradictory desire to anchor it, but also to let it float. So I think the shifting tableau thing that you noticed, it's very clear in unmappable moves, especially because of the way they are laid out. And I think perhaps that also comes from my lifetime of being a lover of cinema. So I watch so much. I've been watching cinema for so long, ever since I was in Kolkata, lining up overnight to get tickets for the international film festival. Cinema is a medium that I cherish deeply, and I think perhaps some of those things that move me about what the cinematic image is able to do, perhaps some of those have unconsciously perhaps entered the way I present the poems themselves.
Just moving on, I'm going to quote now, so I'm looking at a text. Introducing your anthology of contemporary Indian writing, which I have here, the Future Library book, you celebrate an absorbent, migratory and protean sense of self. And when I was talking yesterday to students at Jadavpur University, I reflected that conversations in India about poetry always turn to conversations about translation and about code switching and inhabiting different languages and the different sensibilities. And you mentioned that earlier on, and you're talking about your two languages and the way in which you move between them. I was also struck that the students were quite agonized about that. It wasn't just about pleasure. So I wonder if you could talk about the pleasures and the problems of linguistic selves and moving between these protean and shifting personae or selves.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I can feel the students' pain, having been there myself. I think it's invariable. It's inescapable, sorry. It's inescapable, um, especially for those of us who happen to also have chosen English literature uh, as our line of study. And I think that complication arises from the double bind of loving and living in English, and also feeling the allegiance to the Matri Bhasha. And there is a sense of conflict. And I think the younger poets, John, in my first book, I have the one and only poem in which I kind of address this thing by looking at it in the eye. And it was a bit of a rant, as youthful poems tend to be. And it said something like, suckled and weaned from your mother tongue, right now in your other tongue. Okay, so you see what I mean? There was a sense of angst and am I doing the right thing? Am I being responsible? All of those things I have been through. But I'm also beginning to see a shift, John. And I mentioned that in my introductory essay, where I say that these disquiets of the double legacy, if it started seeming like a bit of a double bind, has increasingly, I think, for a lot of, I'm speaking for more for the community of poets who also happen to be translators. Now that is an increasing tribe, and it is that's a tribe I'm very proud and privileged to belong to. And I feel a lot of us have addressed this disquiet by bending our skills in what continues to be our primary language, which is English, by bending our skills to bringing the poems that we have loved from our different mother tongues into the language we write in. So I think that's how we've kind of addressed this problem. And I think we are no longer, at least the practicing poets, perhaps the academics and the scholars and the students are still um, anguishing about it, but I think the poets have reached a level of not just acceptance but also a robust engagement that fills them with confidence. In the introduction, I write about an earlier poet, a precursor of ours, Dilip Chitre, and he's in Iowa City, and he's observing the natives who are the native to the city. And he uses the words of bitter and bewildered. And I feel that now we've reached a state of um, not complacency at all, but a state of very well earned confidence that enables us to be neither bitter nor bewildered about our double legacies, sometimes more than double, triple legacies.
Right. Well, I was very struck when one student said to me, English is an Indian language. Don't forget that. And that was very, very assertive moment. It felt defensive as well. Being defensive.
So in fact, this is the thing, and I feel that there must be perhaps they need to. It's the time for the defense is long over. That battle has been won by our forebears, to whom, like people like me, owe a great debt of gratitude.
Right. I'm now going to shift to something which is going to put you on the spot, because I'm going to refer to your recent pieces of prose writing about cities, and you write about Kolkata. And I'm speaking to you from Kolkata, and the beginning of your piece in another town around Kolkata starts, "In Kolkata, mothers strangle their sons," and goes on to talk about how Kolkata mothers strangle their sons with love. And interestingly enough, yesterday I was talking to Rimi Chatterjee, whom I believe you know, and she was saying that mothers strangle their daughters in Calcutta. So there seems to be a little theme here. And I'm wondering about how this relates to the protean sense of self, that there seems to be, on the one hand, a certain kind of stricture, and on the other hand, a sense of sort of infinite malleability or possibility.
Yeah, I've been grinning broadly as you said that. And of course, Rimi, if she's listening in, hello. Kolkata has been, just to take one step back, holds a very complicated and complex place in my heart. So you have truly put me in the spot. But it's the city I literally ran away from, and the city I ran towards is where I'm located now in Bombay. Having said which, Kolkata is also the only poem to which I dedicated a love poem. So it's like, where do I put this love? And it says, to Kolkata, the city I left behind. And it's clear that this I had to get far away in order to love it. But in the piece that you quoted from John, it's from a prose selection. It's like a prose composition where I look at London, Pondicherry, Tallinn, and Kolkata. And it's interesting that it's called another town, thereby almost saying that Kolkata is not a town; it's a city. But I think my to answer your question about how this uh, restriction as well as release acts as perhaps some kind of mechanism that is determining my protean, and perhaps even other writers' protean poetic personas, I think absolutely, because if one stayed, for me particularly, um, if I stayed in one place for too long, I feel a terrific sense of restlessness. And it is a kind of transcendental restlessness. It doesn't have to do with just the body. It's like, can I just go somewhere that is not here? And I think that elsewhere being the place that I want to be is also a recurring theme, which I didn't realize till I did a project which took me to Kolkata in the company of a Welsh poet, a young Welsh poet, Eric Salisbury. And we walked around Kolkata, and he wrote 7 poems about it, and I wrote one poem called City in 7 Dislocations. And I realized to what a great extent, I think the key word there is dislocation. Without the dislocation, I cannot claim my place on this planet. So whether it's feeling dislocated in Canterbury and therefore writing Chronicles of an Alien, or writing a book called Elsewhere, Where Else, as if elsewhere is the only place I could successfully feel at home. Um, I think this probably also ties back to what you asked earlier about the anxieties of our multiple inheritances. Perhaps that makes us mm, seek and travel. It's that, like, Elizabeth Bishop, one of my favorite poets. She has that line in Questions of Travel where she says, "Should we have stayed at home wherever that may be?" I think I'm still answering that question in book after book after book in tangential ways.
Mhm. Well, I guess if you really wanted to dislocate yourself, you could be the first Indian writer to write in Welsh. That would be quite something. Uh, but
That
anyway,
would be something. That
yeah.
would be something. And it has crossed my mind, considering the years. It was lovely to hear you have a Welsh connection. I have a deep love for the Welsh and their landscapes and their literature. And often when we speak, the cadences of the language, the way we pronounce the English language, the intonations, we mirror each other, and that
It's
feels
quite
very
true.
close. Another kind of
Yes.
hobby. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, that's surprisingly true. Now, formally, your poems really run the gamut between a poem like a skew, where the attention is right down at the syllable level, and the kind of unraveling sentences of Space Gulliver. Extraordinary range formally. And you just mentioned that the new book, in some sense, is a series of homages to your ancestors poetically. Would you like to talk a little bit about those affiliations and what writers you feel close to?
Oh, yes, I'd love to. And in fact, there's a line in the poem which one of the poems which was picked out by one of the very kind poets who wrote a blurb for me, where she says, "Between reading and imaging have we said what is possible." And I think this entire book is a kind of search for how do I insert myself within how do I insert find the spaces rather, between my readerly self and my writerly self. And if you turn to the back of the book, I will show it on screen if at all it's visible. I'm not sure. I'm very bad at these things, but perhaps this is a bad idea. What I have at the back of the book is a block of text which looks a bit like a concrete poem,
Mhm.
which lists every single of the writers, um, to whom, as I write in my acknowledgements, I turned or returned to for solace, laughter, mystery, splendor, grit, gravitas, experimentation, syncopation, style, and serenity. In short, all that my life seemed shorn off. And I think this sudden dependency on books um, reached a kind of uh, I think it reached a kind of um, a sort of very. I'm searching for the word because it's not a turning point. It's more like the turn of the screw, where you realize that it's this is it. I think it's also the pandemic or sequestration that made me look around at the books that are surrounding me and say, I will get through this. Everybody's here. Everybody I need is in this room. All right. And to mention some of those names, because I read a lot of literature in translation, there's Vladislav Vankura, who's the Czech writer. There's a lot of fiction. There's Tim Burton. There's Don DeLillo. There's the fine poet and scholar John Stallworthy. There's Ray Bradbury, not surprising given my love for science fiction. There's Michael Ondaatje, whose poetry and prose I like in equal measure. There's Eunice D'Souza, one of the forerunners, the finest women poets we've had in English um, poetry written out of India. There's I'm looking for there's Elliot Weinberger, whose essays and translations I deeply love. There's Margaret Duras. There's Sharon Morris, a very fine Welsh poet, Welsh origin poet who writes in English. There's Walter Tevis. There's Susan Sontag. There's Arundhati Subramaniam. There's Wallace Stevens. Uh, there's Virginia Woolf. There's Imtiaz Dharkar. So it's like This is my family. And what I've learned from them has been more as a reader than as a student of literature, because I did also have uh, the quote unquote misfortune of being a student of English literature. And I had to kind of run away from it in order to reclaim it. I once had a ME student asking me at a reading in Bombay, "Ma'am, what saved literature for you?" And I was like, I had to run away so that I could come back and claim it on my own terms. So yeah, so structurally I'm very interested in craft. I'm very interested in the way in which so many of these writers blur the boundaries between prose and poetry, um, and relentlessly pursue the possibilities of what language can give them, without at any point turning so cerebral that it feels like an intellectual exercise for its own sake.
So we're nearing the end of this festival of poetry, and it's been quite an experience to get this picture of contemporary Indian poetry in such a concentrated way. And you just mentioned a distinguished Indian woman poet, and I know you've edited an anthology of Indian women poets. And one thing that struck me, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, or is just an accident to people who are talking at this conference, is that Indian women poets seem much more open, not only personally, but also aesthetically and politically, than the male poets. Now, this is a provocation to say this, but would you agree with that? Is that a correct perception?
You know, yeah, what a difficult question to answer. Perhaps even more difficult than the one about Kolkata. But I spent 5 years editing the poetry pages in a wonderful print magazine called the Indian Quarterly, which unfortunately folded up post pandemic. And that was when I realized that the sharpest, the fiercest, the spikiest, the most moving, the experimental, the most, the goose flesh inducing poetry was coming from the women. And I said this to a peer, a friend of mine, and I said, "Wow, what's going on?" And it feels wonderful to be um, witness to this literal. Um, it's like a. It's more than a coming. It's more than a coming into one's own, because we've had such powerful role models, because somebody who has read Eunice would know what she was able to say then. Some of us would still struggle to say now. So we have very fierce and formidable ancestors who have shown us the way. Very fierce and formidable women editors. For example, Eunice and Melanie co-edited a wonderful anthology, which is one of my go-to anthologies, called These My Words. And I think the enterprise, it's a fleeter ship. It's a fleeter ship with uh, yeah, it's very nice for me to hear that we seem more open. I have a feeling that perhaps we are less. Uh, I don't know. I can't speak for others, but I kind of very often tend to be gender blind. That was the way I was brought up in Darjeeling. I grew up in a boys' school. It was very much later that I realized there was a thing called gender and separation and all of those things. And also working with people who work from the LGBTQ space, queer poets. I'm seeing a lot of the blurrings are happening, um, even in a formal sense. So it's fact into feeling, feeling into form. And a lot of the people who are able to make that transition happen also to be women.
Well, the sense that it is possible to do almost anything or go almost anywhere is one which contrasts quite strongly with certain tendencies in contemporary American culture and poetry, and the proposition that you should or could only write about something which is in the domain of your identity, and that it's illegitimate to stray outside that. So Indian poetry then represents a quite different trajectory from that, and one which I think is an exceedingly hopeful one. I know that you've traveled a great deal and that you have been in the US and the UK, and I wonder if you have any reflections on the kind of different worlds of English language poetry in the different countries.
Again, yeah, this is also so lovely. I think a lot of it, so many of these things that we study in the classroom are so limited. So I do remember when I was living on campus at the University of Kent, some of the poets who were teaching then um, opened doors which I would possibly never have walked through those doors, leave alone know that they existed. And I felt that there was a sense, particularly in that community, where the recording of your immediate neighborhood, for example, to look very closely at your place. Like my sense of place tends to be capacious. It's like, okay, the world is my place, and uh, I will just transplant myself, and wherever I happen to be will be my home. Whereas I did notice, and they did it extraordinarily well. The poets that whose work I discovered, as it were, where they looked very closely at their immediate context, whether it was Dover, whether it was, let's say, the uh, political things about the holding of refugees at Dover port, whether it was marking the walking trails in Kent. Um, there was this commitment which felt very, very local, John. It was like, I will look at this square mile. And that to me was very, very interesting because apart from, say, my Bombay book, and I have a Bombay book which is also in poetry, of course, but I think the free range mode is something that we gravitate to perhaps naturally, at least I know I do. In the US, again, I feel there is, of course, there's this whole thing about narrative poetry. Who writes narrative poetry anymore? There is a some of the poets have told me that, this is so old fashioned that people are still writing what are basically quote unquote stories, except that they are line breaks. So I think that the impulse to tell stories is one that still continues to motivate a lot of Indian poets. And perhaps that's not surprising, considering that our great epics were told in poetry. So perhaps we trust that mode a lot more. Yeah, I think that's one of the things I could say offhand. I made a lot of wonderful discoveries while editing Future Library. Um, and it's very interesting to see how the concept of return, for example, is addressed differently by a poet living in the US and a poet perhaps living in India. And it was very, very interesting to see the which we use the same language, but what was giving it its specificity and granularity was where we were and how we had grown up, and how that colored our perception of the world.
Yeah, I suppose that a sense of place based on Mumbai must be very different from a sense of place based on Canterbury. But Future Library, of course,
Another
has
dislocation.
yeah. But Future Library has a view of Indian poetry which is global. There are writers practicing right across the globe. So it's an extraordinary range represented in this book. And it's a book of discoveries for me as well as for you as its editor. And I'm very grateful for it. I'm just wondering, I see that we're running short of time. So could we perhaps end with a couple more poems from the new book, just as a way to finish this
I'd love to
conversation?
do that. I'd love to do that. And I'll just see which one might connections. I'm going to read a poem called Camaraderies. This is not false. Springing all about me, this forgotten joy, the first deluge of the season, unleashing unreasonable gaiety. Everyone voluble, bizarre camaraderies at the liquor store, little wayward boats, school kids streaming back home. Inside, we are safe, warm, dry. We have looked out for each other, called, warned, delighted in this unforeseen event that has allowed us to stay close, clink glasses, read under bright yellow lamps overflowing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sampurna. It was a great pleasure to talk to you today. And I look forward to exploring more in your extraordinary archive of writing. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.